How important are those relationships, building those throughout your career to your future success?
The relationships are all of it, right? I mean, you have to have some substantive knowledge, which you can pick up. You have to show up, but it's the relationships that matter, and you have to develop new ones and you have to nurture the existing ones. The relationships really are central and fundamental.
Hello and welcome to The Clear Voice, brought to you by Clear Career Professionals. We are joined today by Clear's president, Michael Bays. Michael, thank you for being with us today, and I'm excited to learn more about this important topic that you brought us.
Yeah, absolutely, James. Serving as city administrator down in Wimberley, Texas, when I first got there, naturally, you're trying to meet members of the community and build those relationships. Our next guest on the program was just one of those people who came in and was such a great resource over my time there. We developed a good friendship and really appreciated all of his insight and just how we could work together to make the community better. He's got a wealth of experience and just a really great servant's heart, and so I'm really excited to have him on the program.
Michael, before you became a city manager, had you spent a lot of time researching groundwater issues in Texas?
I had not. When I was looking at applying for the city of Wimberley, naturally, water is a really important part of what they have as a community, with Jacob's Well being nearby, such a great resource, in Blue Hole being such a major part of what the city has going on. So I knew water was going to be important. It was a little bit different moving down to that region when you're looking at development, and then how you needed to have pervious surfaces to where water could drain through and get to the water table. From a development standpoint, and then, city project standpoint, there was a lot of learning to do and kind of understanding the impact of water throughout the region. And our next guest really helped out with that and was able to provide some good insight for me.
That's great. It's my honor to introduce this week's guest. Andrew Weber is a Texas attorney and public policy leader based in Wimberley, Texas. He currently serves as president and executive director of Trinity Edward Springs Protection Association, and he's also with the Friends of Wimberley Parks, nonprofits deeply engaged in groundwater protection and regional water stewardship. Professionally, he's a partner at Kelly Hart and Hallman, where he leads the Austin office and co-chairs the firm's public law practice. Andrew also served on the staff of the Texas Supreme Court and later as first Assistant Attorney General of Texas, giving him firsthand experience at the highest levels of state government before transitioning into advocacy focused on aquifer, sustainability, and water governance. Andrew, welcome to the show, and we're glad to have you.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Andrew, can you walk us through early life? What led you into the law? And when you were heading into the law, did you ever imagine that you would be championing water rights?
Well, I'll start with the last part. I didn't envision ever championing water rights. I will say I started paying attention to water in a very different way. Mid-'70s, I had the opportunity to go to California for a couple of weeks and visit friends, and I happened to land when they had just announced some water restrictions on water use in the Bay Area. At first, it was pretty jarring. You put a stopper in the tub, and you don't drain the bath water, and you don't flush at certain times. Anyway, there were various rules, and they were all new and foreign to me. But I have to say, by the end of 2, 3, 4 days, it didn't seem crazy, and in fact, seemed pretty easy to incorporate into my life. That was on just a real personal level. So no, I didn't really see it evolving into something I would do as my avocation, but here we are. On law school, I didn't get there in any traditional way. Got married out of college, started teaching high school, decided I didn't like being that broke and working that hard. So started a landscape and construction business in the Austin area and did that until I was on the verge of turning 40. And then went to law school for the great and lofty reason of I didn't want to be on a roof anymore in Texas. I didn't really have a big horizon on what that would lead me to. I just knew I wanted to get paid to read and think and write instead of nailing boards. So went to law school and was lucky enough in the middle of law school to get a law court job at the Texas Supreme Court. And as fate would have it, the judge who hired me resigned before I got there. I guess he saw that coming. A young baby judge out of Houston got appointed to the bench, and that was Greg Abbott. I worked for then Justice Greg Abbott, then went to private practice, then back. So I'm that guy who's been in and out of government 2 or 3 times. As we moved to Wimberley and I started looking at retirement, it became clear that whether it was the retirement plan I had planned, the one I was going to get was working on water.
Well, it's amazing to me anytime that I meet somebody who pivots out of something especially drastic, going from teaching to the contracting business, the landscaping business, and then pivoting again to law school, which is way different than either one of those. Can you talk a little bit to our audience before we get into the groundwater stuff about having those opportunities and sometimes taking them? There's a lot of people in their 40s that think they're stuck doing whatever they're doing.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it was stupidity or courage or both, right? But I will say that what I found is when I got there, the first couple of days of law school, I was in a sheer panic, thinking these 22-year-old kids are just going to tear it up. And I haven't written more than 2 sentences and haven't written more than an essay in 15 or 20 years at that point. But what became clear by the end of the first week was that there were a couple of us who were older in the group, and it was clear that it was Friday morning at 9:00 and we were all there. And it was also clear that about half the kids weren't. And so it was one of those, by the time you're 40, if you haven't figured out that showing up is the big thing. So that turned out to be fine. Law intimidates people in a way that I'm not sure I ever really understood and don't understand having done it. It's all wordplay. If you like wordplay, you'd love being a lawyer. What it got me, though, it turned out, I've always been more opportunistic than strategic. And again, I got this 1-year clerkship at the Texas Supreme Court that led to other job titles at the court, got into private practice, and then Attorney General Abbott asked me to come join him at the AG's office as a deputy. Then I got the chance to be first assistant for a couple of years. And suddenly, to paraphrase a Hamilton line, I got to be in the room where it was happening. I never thought I would be in that room, but getting to spend 3 years in that room and then the years at the Supreme Court, I felt like I had a pretty good handle on both ways that law gets made and policy gets made. My practice of law evolved more into a lobby practice, a government relations practice, helping people at the legislature and helping people who had problems with state agencies. There's nothing more terrifying, I've learned, for people than to get a nasty letter from TxDOT or the controller or the AG or whatever governmental agency it is. And having sent some of those letters, I felt like I could help people navigate that world. That all kind of got me there. And then, like I say, on the personal side, over the last 10 years especially, I've been more and more involved in the nonprofit world here in Wimberley, where I live, and bringing some of those legal skills and government relations skills to the nonprofit world.
You mentioned showing up is half the battle. Clearly, there's a lot of very competent people, including yourself, in the legal profession, some very sharp minds. How important are relationships? Get the opportunity to work for Governor Abbott at the beginning of your career, and then later you get another opportunity to work with him. How important are those relationships, building those throughout your career to your future success?
So, the relationships are all of it, right? I mean, you have to have some substantive knowledge, which you can pick up. You have to show up, which we talked about. But it's the relationships that matter, and you have to develop new ones and you have to nurture the existing ones. But yeah, one of the things I didn't understand when I went to work at the AG's office for Attorney General Abbott was that it wasn't just the relationships that I developed while I was there, especially with other state agency heads and their general counsels, because they were our clients right at the AG's office. So I thought that was pretty good, right? I had this huge Rolodex, if you will, of all these state leaders that I had been in the room with and worked with as their lawyer or the first assistant trying to shepherd some project. But what I didn't anticipate was the other piece, which was that all these people that I was working with at the Attorney General's office, most of whom were younger than I was, right? They had long careers ahead of them. And they would go other places and do other things. And it's those relationships and where those would go that I didn't understand at really any level until it started happening. And that's what has sustained my ability to help people over the years, is that, One of my former division chiefs who I dearly love, a really good friend, is now the insurance commissioner, right? I doubt I'll have anything I need to do at the insurance commission, but if I do, I know I can at least have a phone call with an old friend. And so it's the relationships really are central and fundamental.
Pivoting into what we're here to talk about, groundwater and the conservation of it. I've been in public service for 25 years. I consider myself fairly in tune with lots of matters that go on. But I can tell you honestly, other than knowing that I'm under a groundwater conservation district, and I know the name of it where I live, but other than that, I don't know a whole lot about what they do. So I'm not sure if I'm behind the curve or if maybe I'm just about average. And can you tell us a little bit about GCDs and why they're important?
Yeah, I don't think, I think you're right in the middle of where everybody is. I will confess that 10 years ago, I don't think I'd heard of a GCD and didn't know what they did. It's become something that I had to learn about and have over the last 5 years, I guess, particularly. So GCDs, groundwater conservation districts, are a creature of something called Chapter 36 of the Water Code in Texas. The legislature, I don't remember now, more than 20 years ago, could be 50, determined that it was going to create by statute these new governmental bodies called groundwater conservation districts. So they, like any government agency, they only have the authority that the legislature gives them. And their charge is to balance resource conservation, in this case water, against the private property rights under the rule of capture in Texas. So that's, 80,000 feet. That's what they're supposed to do. Now, one big issue with groundwater conservation districts is you don't automatically get one, right? The fact that Chapter 36 tells you how to create one and what they can and can't do, it doesn't automatically create a GCD in each region across the state. So this was, again, the legislature deciding that this was going to be a relatively local issue as opposed to a state-driven issue, and that may be morphing as we speak, but that was the setup for GCDs. So, for instance, there's been the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer District here in half of Hays County for a while. It took a tremendous effort, I'm told, I wasn't on the ground at the time, to get a because it's got to be one of your local reps, your state senator or your House rep has to carry the legislation to create a district if you want one. It took a tremendous effort and years to get, at the time, I believe it was Patrick Rose or it may have been Jason Isaac was the House rep in this area, to finally carry legislation to create the Hays Trinity Groundwater Conservation District. When they create it, they determine which of the buckets from Chapter 36 that are allowed to fund one of these things will fund the one they're creating or not. They decide from among the Chapter 36 authorities that can be given to one, which ones will be given to this one. They decide whether the board will be elected or appointed by the county commissioners. Again, if you picture Chapter 36 as the broad umbrella of how to do these things, and then whether you do one and what yours looks like is a very local issue. One of the, and we can talk about this if you want, but one of the big issues that is becoming pretty acute, especially based on a hearing in the House Natural Resources Committee a week or so ago, it was pretty clear that it's a nonpartisan acuteness. And that is, there are areas of the state that don't have one. So if it's an area of the state that, there are counties in Texas with 10 people, right? So if it's an area of Texas where there aren't a lot of straws in the aquifer, it kind of doesn't matter, or at least it doesn't matter yet. But what is starting to pinch is where you have a GCD that is really, where the aquifer is really stressed. So they've gone into stage 3 or 4 and telling people to really abate usage. But right next door by a relatively artificial governmental line, right? A county line, some other line where this GCD stops, and you go right over that line, and it's what the state is calling a white area, and a white area has no GCD. So query if you're trying to run your GCD here and say, quit pumping so much water out. Tell your residents no outside watering. You're doing all the things you can do, but it's the aquifer doesn't respect the county line, right? So where the white district starts, it's the Wild West for the most part. I mean, TCEQ has some authority there, right? That's really one of the biggest things I heard from lawmakers most recently is how are we going to deal with that problem? And I think we'll see something next session. I don't know what the solution will be. Again, these are all hard because you're balancing conservation and somebody else's private property right. That's going to be one of the big issues they're trying to figure out.
Yeah, and Andy, working in the Wimberley area, it's pretty interesting when you look at the concept of water and how for that particular region and many regions throughout Texas, but since, I have familiarity there, the resources like as Blue Hole, which is just such an amazing, unique experience in Texas, relies heavily upon water. And I remember when I was there, the water issues really were impacting that, and I'm still sure they are today. But when you look at it, it's a pretty natural tragedy of the commons issue, right? Where you're discussing this limited resource that exists for all of Texas, and then how we manage the use of that natural resource really will determine what the future of Texas looks like.
Right. And I think, again, this isn't my unique to me phrase, but a number of people are suggesting that Wimberley, the Wimberley area is a bit of one of the canaries in the coal mine, right? Jacob's Well, an artesian spring upstream, but it's the mouth of Cypress Creek upstream from Blue Hole, the swimming hole. I'm going to say 4 years ago, I could be off a year or two, it doesn't really matter. The well stopped flowing again, and Blue Hole swimming passes had to be revoked, and the swimming hole was shut down. It flows a little longer after Jacob's Well stops flowing because there are springs right there at Blue Hole, right? And it's downstream inside the aquifer from Jacob's Well. So it kept flowing for a while, but they ended up having to stop about a month early. And according to park staff at the time, the cost of closing that pool a month early was about $100,000. So this is not just some lefty woke kind of thing. This is a real business, economic, especially for an area like Wimberley, which is heavily reliant on ecotourism stuff. The flow at Jacob's Well and Barton and the creek, Blue Hole, as well as the Blanco, are all at record lows. The stream flows are record lows. The Blanco's record lows. I will give you just an anecdote. We have a little house on Blanco River for kids and grandkids and family to hang out and nonprofits to have meetings. And we bought it after the big flood. The first few years, we would swim in the river pretty much through summer. But with the super low flow we've had for the last 2 or 3 years, it is unpleasant to be in the river starting in mid-June to early July because there's too many days where it's too hot. The water doesn't cool down. So if you get in at 7 a.m. for about a half hour, it's okay, right? But in the afternoon, it's a warm bath. That I don't think is going to keep the tourists coming. So it's always a big issue here, but I think at the confluence of the creek and the river, we're all seeing it and feeling it firsthand.
I know we're talking about Texas GCDs, but nationally, I see news stories fairly regularly about water issues a lot in the west side of the country, California, and all through those states. I see articles about where they're restricting not just groundwater, but like you're not even allowed to, in certain places, take the water off of your roof, like rain barrels aren't allowed. Are there places that don't have these issues at all, or is everybody struggling with trying to figure out how to conserve what we've got?
To say everybody has them would be hyperbolic. I have a granddaughter at Northwestern outside Chicago. When I went to visit her the first time, looking around at real estate, which I always do because I used to kind of be in that business, you pull up a listing and you look at water source and it's Lake Michigan. Right? So when you look out at Lake Michigan, no, the people there are not overly concerned about, they may have a water quality issue or something, right? But quantity is not, it's not on their horizon to be concerned about. I grew up in Houston. For the most part, the Houston area doesn't have a water problem. They may have a subsidence problem, but they don't necessarily have much of a water problem unless they get into a really extended drought, right? That said, to your point, I have a film I've shown a couple of times called Written on Water, and it's looks at the Ogallala Aquifer, which is, up into Nebraska and down into northern Texas. Similar story. Again, I think it's like cities did with rivers, I'm told, in the 1800s, where you just dumped everything in the river because it was so enormous and flowing that you just never dreamed that could be a problem, right? And I think pumping, whether it's surface water, at least with surface water, though, you can see Lake Travis going down, right? And I think that's a big part of the problem with groundwater issues is we haven't figured out a good way to show it, to articulate it in a way that it's easy for people to really incorporate what's going on. So I think it's certainly a statewide issue. It's been gratifying, unfortunately, in some ways, to see state leaders start to acknowledge that it's a crisis and we've got to start creating state level policies as well as regional to deal with it. Yes, especially as you go west in the United States, it's a problem. Mexico City's a problem. Iran's got problem. I think there's an awareness that it's a worldwide problem. The question I think now is, how do we deal with it, right? I mean, and to me, it's always been a mix of reduced use, reuse, and smart use, new ways to get water. Can you desal? Yeah, you can desal, but if you talk to Corpus, that's been a struggle, and financially and politically a struggle, right, to do desal. And it's not the holy grail, right? I mean, you got this huge pile of saline water, and what do you do with it? Nothing is pure. There's no silver bullet. I think we're all struggling. My big thing is to try to get into people's heads and help think about how we each can do what we can do in addition to whatever policies and rules and regs come down.
Can you tell us a little bit about the nonprofits you're associated with and what they do, how you use those to work on some of these issues?
Sure. So I'm involved in a couple of nonprofits. A couple of them have almost nothing to do directly with water. The Wimberley Library Foundation is kind of the capital funding nonprofit for the library. But even there, before I got on that board, they were instrumental in helping shape. When they recently did a new nice addition to the library, they went with a one water concept. Just an awareness that as you're building something now, there's this crazy idea you can collect water off the roof. To your point, I think Colorado still has laws that you have to get a permit to collect the water off your roof. The first time I heard that sounded crazy, but it's kind of not, right? I mean, you can take anything to an extreme, and if everybody's capturing rainwater, there's not as much of it getting to the aquifer in the creek. So I understand that concept. We just don't have that here, and I'm grateful we don't. The Friends of Wimberley Parks, formerly known as the Friends of Blue Hole, is a group that was started when that park was no more than a dream. And it was started to raise the funds, about $4 million, to capture the property through the grace and great help of the Peter and Mary Fay Way Foundation. That board now exists to help the city fund, again, capital type projects in that park. But then again, at some point, we looked up and realized that there were a handful of parks now in Wimberley, and we rebranded as Friends of the Wimberley Park so that we're available to help with all of them. But again, that nonprofit is super engaged in the water issues because you don't have Blue Hole Park if you can't go swimming and the creek isn't flowing and all those kinds of things. And again, all the other parks and the economics of the area depend on water and groundwater particularly. The biggest effect, I guess, that I think we will have as a nonprofit is the TESPA organization that you referred to when you introduced me, the Trinity Edwards Springs Protection Association. That group was founded about 10, 11 years ago when there was a company called Electropurification that had some test wells and was getting permits to pump water from over by Hayes City Store on a couple of big ranches, and they were going to, pump, I don't remember how many gazillion gallons. and send them over to the east part of the county where development is more intensive. As you might imagine, the people across 3237 from those wells, a community called Rolling Oaks, were suddenly petrified because they rightly, I think correctly understood that if those massive wells went in and started pumping that kind of water, then their 300 to 500 foot wells were going to go dry. And so TESPA was birthed to see if we could keep that from happening. And I have to say, through a combination of litigation, or at least threatened litigation, and some legislative efforts, EP, electropurification, eventually decided this was not a fight they wanted to have, and so they packed it up and went home. Since then, we have fought the Kinder Morgan pipeline that was coming through. We didn't stop it, but we got it rerouted so that it wouldn't go under the Blanco in a couple of places and create some potential issues there. Currently, we are in litigation with Aqua Texas at the PUC, and we intervened and then unintervened in a federal lawsuit that Aqua Texas brought against Hayes Trinity Groundwater Conservation District. We are monitoring Aqua Texas's rate case, and if it sounds like I'm talking a lot about Aqua Texas, I guess that's because I am. I mean, Aqua Texas is the for-profit, publicly owned and traded water provider in the area. And then there's Dripping Springs Water Supply Corporation, I think is their name. Again, more of a co-op, not for-profit. And then there's Wimberley Water Supply. TESPA is always on the lookout. We're looking at data centers. We're looking at a potential mining project in the area. And again, traditionally, our work has been to bring the lawyers and the government relations to the party. But I was asked to take over TESPA in June from Jim Blackburn, a well-known environmental lawyer. I am engaged in a huge fundraising and broadening our scope effort to, again, move us into some education and some other things to maybe blunt the degree to which we have to keep going to court.
Well, you mentioned data centers. That's a big topic in a lot of communities around us. What's the impact of some of those centers? And I know they've got some that may use less water, like reuse it inside the facility. What are your thoughts on all these data centers coming in?
Yeah, so two concerns with the data centers are, one, direct use of water, right, for cooling. And then second, the amount of water that it takes to produce electricity in most instances in this area. So the data centers, again, one of the arguments that they use for them is, well, if you don't let us put the data center on this land, then we're just going to go develop it into 200 homes like we can do if you don't do that. I don't like being extorted, so that doesn't work, doesn't feel right to me, and I don't react well to that argument, but I comprehend it. So I think that's the big issue is, again, the direct water suck and then the electricity water suck. I am aware, as you mentioned, that there are some that are saying we can reuse and recycle the water. So far, when those have gotten down to the wire, they've said, well, that's not quite ready for prime time, but we're going to go ahead and build it, and within a year or two, we'll bring that closed loop system in. I will say, again, it's not an issue that I've been to a few meetings and have done some research and some due diligence. I've been so far relying on others to be the direct advocates in the room, but you may have seen that recently, like in the last week or so, the City Council of San Marcos rejected a big data center. And I mean, it's a huge, huge grassroots efforts. Kudos to the kids, because it was mostly the youth in the San Marcos area, including the university, who really led that charge. And by all accounts, I think did an amazing job at turning the politics of that particular data center around and getting so the city has rejected it, and the applicant has to wait 6 months before they can come back.
Well, we just finished legislative session, and we're already gearing up for election season, and I'm going to get ready for the next session. Where do we stand right now with GCDs? Do they have enough authority? I know you said they're pondering what they're going to do with the white zones. What do you think may come out of the legislation session, and what came out recently?
Well, there were a couple of things that came out of last session on GCD, some some recording and reporting information that they are going to be held to do now that I think will help everybody. But the big thing that came out of last session, of course, was the $20 billion a year that the state's going to fund into water projects and water solutions generally. I think it's a 20-year run, so it's $20 billion a year for 20 years, which is whoever that senator was who said it's almost like real money. I think the legislature acknowledged and recognized last session that water was a huge issue, and they spent a fair amount of time and energy on some water issues. From the sublime to the mundane, right? From the $20 billion a year to a bill a piece of legislation that said homeowners and POAs can no longer fine you for having a brown yard, in so many words, right? That sounds almost like not such a big deal, but it's a big deal to me in terms of a statement of how the legislature as a body is starting to think, right? For the legislature as a body to say, we're not going to allow anybody to penalize you for not watering your yard, that speaks volumes to me. There was $7.5 million last session for groundwater conservation districts. PWDB, the Water Development Board, is in charge of administering those grants. I know that our local districts are in the process of applying. I think the deadline is the middle of March. They are applying for some of that money. The biggest downside for us last session was our one groundwater district is fairly well funded, the Barton Springs district. The other one has been inadequately funded since it was born. So we worked really hard. People have worked hard many sessions before this, but we worked really hard last session to get a bill that would add. So again, in Chapter 36, there are 3 funding streams for groundwater districts. They can get funding from hookup fees. So when a new home comes online, the developer charges $3, they pass through $1,000, let's say, to the groundwater district, right? They can collect money on production fees from the water provider, right? 20, 30, 35 cents on every 1,000 gallons pumped, or they can have an ad valorem tax. Hayes Trinity only has permit fees and tap fees. Well, if you think through that very far, it doesn't take a real mental giant to understand that it's antithetical to conservation if all your funding comes from new permits and new tap fees, right? So we worked really hard to add the production fee under Chapter 36 to that groundwater district, which would have brought in about $400,000 more a year for their operating. After yeoman's efforts and many, many permutations, it would take a whole nother hour. We got that bill through, despite objections from our local House rep, Kerry Isaac, and despite initial objections from our state senator, Donna Campbell. We got it through. Unfortunately, because Representative Isaac was so against the bill, and her former chief of staff used to work for Aqua, so maybe there's something there, maybe not. Who's to say? But Representative Isaac was heavily against the bill. Aqua Texas, as you might imagine, was hard against the bill. Would have cost them 20, 30 cents per 1,000 gallons, which they could have passed through, and I assume would have passed through to their customers. Nonetheless, I know they're lobbyists. I've worked with their lobbyists on other projects. They're friends of mine. So we agree to disagree on this. They were better and more successful than we were in the post-session period, and they got the governor to veto the bill. That will be high on our list again next session. We'll be working on that. I think the other thing for next session, comes under the title of thank God for bad things happening sometimes. There's a billionaire named Kyle Bass who owns a big ranch that happens to be in the chair of Natural Resources District. And so when Mr. Bass announced recently that he was doing some test wells and he was going to drill on his own property, again, to send the water to Dallas or whoever needs it and can pay for it, it was just one of those where suddenly the Republican chair of the House Natural Resources Committee was calling meetings and talking about what do we need to do to have a GCD where we don't have one? What do we do to give these GCDs maybe some more immunity from lawsuit? What do we do to give them the funding they need? I mean, one of the biggest problems these GCDs have is when I talk about, okay, now they're going to have to make this report and they're going to have to make that report and they're supposed to do all this modeling for what groundwater looks like. They don't have any money, right? Or at least not that kind of money. So this $7.5 million for some grants, it's great in the scope of things. Is it enough? No, but I'll take it, one bite at a time. I think from comments made at the last hearing that Chairman Harris had, again, totally nonpartisan. Every member of the House Natural Resources Committee was talking about, what are we going to do about the white zones? What are we going to do to fund these GCDs? What are we going to do to keep them from being sued into bankruptcy? And I think, again, they all acknowledge that these are going to be hard, but they all acknowledge they're going to have to solve for X, and I take them at their word. I think they will be working on that.
I guess the problem is that Texas is developer friendly, business friendly. And then, you mentioned earlier that, on the surface, if you look at this as an environmental issue, which is not necessarily huge in Texas politics, although you make a compelling case why it's not just an environmental issue. So I guess that's why the politics of this is just difficult to get enough people on board in Texas.
Yeah, I think the politics has always been difficult. I chide some of my friends at the legislature and say, it's a good thing we don't have climate change on top of everything else, because, we either don't believe in it or we discount it, or wherever you are on that spectrum. And so as a policy matter, again, that's why it's heartening to me that when I hear state leaders say we have a water crisis. Now, we can have very different ideas on how to solve that crisis, whether it means we're going to go buy water on the East Coast and pipeline it in. That's kind of the big picture solution, whether we're going to focus on conservation. But I do think the train is coming. As recently as 2 years ago, when people would tell me about they wanted to get rid of or make major changes to the rule of capture, which is the rule that that's the broad general rule, right? Is you can capture above you to the sky and below you to the center of the earth, whatever is there, including water. Well, groundwater conservation districts are already a modification of that absolute rule, right? And I think what the legislature understands is, but 2 years ago, even when we would have that conversation, I would say, when pigs fly. I mean, I've been involved in this thing for a long time, and the Texas Legislature, under its current makeup and the foreseeable future, is not going to say that out loud, because there are big ranchers. I mean, the billionaire groups who've been buying ranches in Texas and throughout the country for at least 50 years for the water. That's a vested water right. I get that, right? And so how you come in now and say, okay, but we're going to put a groundwater conservation district over here, and it's going to tell you, it's kind of like but again, I think there's an analog here, right? I mean, we've seen the Texas Railroad Commission have oil depletion rules and those sorts of things. So it's not that we've never done this before. It's just we haven't done it effectively with water. That's what I expect to see out of the legislature this next session, especially with Chairman Harris now saying, I mean, during this hearing a couple of weeks ago, he said, look, we have got to figure out how to tweak, modify, amend, put guardrails on, pick your metaphor, pick your euphemism on the rule of capture. I never thought 2 years ago I would hear that in my lifetime. I was working on it. I just didn't think I'd see it.
So it sounds like you have a little bit of optimism in the legislators at least talking about it. Anything else to be hopeful for?
Yeah, I think what makes me hopeful is that, again, I'm not just hearing state leaders talk about the water crisis. I'm hearing it's got national traction, it's got international traction, but it's also got increasingly local traction, right? Like our county judge a week or so ago. Now, maybe this is, politics. Everybody's running right now. So there may be an element of that to it. But for the county judge in Hays County to step out and say, I'm going to declare a moratorium on all new development, again, that takes that's a political risk. I'm hearing it at the state level, which I thought I'd never heard here. I'm also starting to hear a lot more chatter among elected leaders at the city and the county level. HTGCD obviously is in it up to their ears. But the other piece is again, like you see the turnout at this data center hearing in San Marcos for the city council. I'm on another nonprofit here in Wimberley called the Wimberley Roundtable that we started about a year ago to hold forums on issues that we hope are of such broad public interest that politics doesn't matter. And so we hosted a forum about a year ago now on water. We had a full house. I think local, normal, average, everyday people are waking up and saying, wait, I shouldn't leave that running while I brush my teeth. Now that my water conservation district or my city or my county has told me I can't water outside, maybe I need to quit planting a lawn that looks like Houston. It reminds me of the organic food thing, I guess. It's like in the 60s and 70s, people in my orbit started saying, well, I want to eat better. I want to eat stuff that doesn't necessarily have a bunch of pesticides. And, everybody laughed us out of the room. And then, 10 or 20 years ago, it kind of started going mainstream. I'm doing a program here in a couple of weeks with a friend of mine who is on the radio, Saul Lacan. She has a program called Mothering Earth, and she started a series about water called WaterWise. And TESPA is going to co-venture with her. I think it's March 21st. I'm going to give an update on all the litigation and what's going on with Aqua Texas and their line losses and some of that kind of stuff. But then I'm also going to spend a half hour talking about real basic, easy conservation measures. We're going to give away 10 rain barrels to put on your gutters on your house. We're going to give away some valves. I've been using these valves since the 1970s. You take your shower head off, you put a little toggle valve between your shower head and that nipple that comes out of the wall, right? And then when you get the temperature where you want it, you turn the volume way down. People come up to me and ask, it's like, can you tell me something simple that I can do at my house? It's like, yeah, I can. So again, I'm focused on trying to work on that end and then also working on litigation when we have to and legislation all the time, all the day.
We'll do our best to push out some information on this podcast and, we'll get some links from you and throw them in the show notes. So if anybody's interested, they can go to the show notes and find more information. I don't know if you caught episode 42 of the podcast, but we talked to Bill King, who's down in Houston, about depopulation and the birth rate. And one of the most plus items of us losing birth rate was the effect of the environment for us. So maybe you guys can talk and maybe he'll make you feel a little bit better about where we might be in 10 or 15, 20 years.
Yeah, that's a whole nother, I was just reading an article about that yesterday, and it's certainly got its pluses and minuses.
It's going to be a different world for sure.
Yes, it is.
Well, before we wrap up, what advice can you give to city managers and people in development services at cities that, a lot of cities really are betting on development coming in? And Michael and I have talked to several people throughout this podcast that are banking on data centers to come in and give them a tax revenue increase. What advice would you have for them, when they're trying to balance this development, pro-development versus the effect on their groundwater that is a scarce resource?
I'm starting a couple businesses. I'm nothing if not got a pretty good entrepreneurial streak. I'm all for capitalism with some, not a laissez-faire guy, but I'm a capitalist. So I believe in development. I think I ought to get to develop my property, right? But I think city leaders and county leaders have got to require smart development. And really, for me, it starts with, where is the water going to come from? And that's why we need the science behind all this modeling for the groundwater conservation districts, right? If we don't have the science, then you can't really tell somebody what's there and what's not there. But we need to say, I think, whether it's a data center or Lennar Homes, here's, the DFCs, the desired future conditions, the maximum available groundwater, all that alphabet acronyms, right? We've got to say to people on the front end, here's how much water we've already agreed to let people have. It's already subscribed. There's only this much left, or there's nothing left. So you tell me how you're going to have the water for your development. Once you show me that, and the HCD and the GCD agrees, and we all agree with the science of how you got there, then you get to develop. But that's the threshold question. And until we solve it on the front end, You can't just go do it. And you can't do it based on, this is where I think we need to go, is that rule of capture is going to be mitigated. The fact that you own the 500 acres cannot mean that you can put a straw in and take out whatever you want. Because again, I think Robert Mace at the Meadows talks about correlative rights. I have to have some articulated right. If I own the water underneath me, one of the sticks in the bundle of ownership of that water has to be my right not to use it today, my right to conserve mine so that my kids and my grandkids have it. There's an analogy out there about a bank account. The problem with is that, the water comes into the aquifer, you can only take that much out. The problem with the analogy is that I control my bank account. I control, for the most part, what goes out of my bank account. The problem here is that you live right next door. You can put a straw in and suck all the water out of my bank account, right? So that's what I think the developers and the city leaders and the county leaders need to be looking at, though, is how do we require, and again, this is going to take statutory changes at the legislature for counties to be able to do much, right? Cities have more control. But how do we say, show me the water before you break ground?
Michael, after working in a city that depended on this groundwater and looking at all the issues, I know you're not anti-development. What advice would you have for city managers while they're trying to figure out what to do with their development?
Yeah, I think, economic development is something that's so important for so many communities. But as you look at depopulation and then the water resources and all that's going on in our world, I think we really need to start becoming comfortable with where we're at and really identifying with our communities as they are. We built a visitor center in Wimberley when I was there and really looked at what's the sustainability of that visitor center. And something that in many cities would have been a very, simple project was a pretty complicated project in Wimberley, just because we wanted to really be resource cognizant and make sure we weren't impacting the area in a negative way. And so I think that's really important as we move forward. I think it's a funny story, Andrew. I kind of want to share, I always had a policy as a city manager or kind of whenever I was in government of if a citizen walked in and I wasn't on something that was critical, I would always meet with them. And a few weeks into my time in Wimberley, I had the secretary come back and say, hey, there's a citizen here who wants to see you. So Andy came into my office and I think we started talking about a parks donation or something, and our city attorney had made a determination using an attorney general's opinion. And Andy was telling me about that, and he said, I think you need to have your city attorney reevaluate that. And I said, well, what makes you think that? And he said, well, because I wrote the opinion. Well, then I definitely should listen to that. But really, I think it just goes to note that, no matter who you were, my goal was to meet with any citizen that came in, but really, taking the opportunity to meet with people as they come in and interact with you when you're working in government, it's really important because you never know what you're going to learn, the relationships you're going to develop, and really what comes out of that. I think it's a great story, and I tell it to people now, but, it always behooves you to take the time to, build those relationships and talk to people.
Yeah, it was great. We missed you.
Yeah, thank you.
Andrew, before we get off, whether it's about water or just anything, these city leaders that we communicate with, do you have any advice as they're going through their daily struggle of trying to figure out what's best for their communities?
No, but I will tell you one resource I would point them to if they're not aware of it is the Hill Country Alliance. HCA, I am told by people who've gone through it, they have really good training, I'm told, by the people who have been through their program on environmental issues, particularly for elected officials. So if it's something that an elected hasn't taken advantage of, I would encourage them to engage with HCA because I think that's a good program.
Thank you guys for both joining us today. Andrew, thank you for what you're doing to bring this issue to light for our listeners. To the listeners, thank you for what you do each and every day for your communities. Please like and subscribe to the podcast. And if you have a chance, give us a rating. Follow Clear on LinkedIn and make sure to check out our website for some wonderful job opportunities. And we will catch you next time.